Hello, J-grads. I'm KP, and you may know me from such classes as J200, J201, Story Structures, and Superclass. All right, now, if you've endured any of those classes, and particularly if you've endured all of those classes, you may be surprised to learn that I have a teaching philosophy. So it certainly came as some surprise to me. So I accidentally stumbled across my teaching philosophy in a book at an art museum. So this was 20 years ago, and I was just beginning. I was a baby reporter at the East Bay Express, and I was at the museum to research a story, and I was taking notes out of the books because I was too cheap to buy them. And back then, all I wanted to do was write. I had no notion of ever being a teacher. I thought, maybe, vaguely in the back of my mind, I thought it might be a cool thing to do when I was like 70. But this thing in this book struck me so hard that I wrote it down because I was a pretty decent baby reporter, and I remembered that you put the important things in the notebook, right? And years later, when I did come back to teach, I typed it up in really big letters, and I printed it out, and I put it up on my wall, and I'm now going to read it to you in its entirety. Now, the thing that became my philosophy is a letter written by a teacher on behalf of a student who is creating a problem. And it goes like this. November 1979, to whom it may concern, Keith Haring is enrolled in my sculpture workshop on Thursdays. However, he is not involved with making objects, and thus he does not use any of our equipment materials. He would like permission to use the Xerox machine instead. Now, for those of you who don't remember the art world of the 1980s, Keith Haring went on to become one of the most admired and prolific pop artists of his generation. He used his artwork to talk about the big issues of his day, issues like the fall of apartheid in South Africa, the rise of crack cocaine in New York City, and the spread of HIV/AIDS around the globe. Now, I should point out that Keith Haring actually did learn how to sculpt. You can go to any number of art museums today and you can see his sculptures. And most of his career, he worked in another really traditional art medium, which is paint, right? But the reason we care so much about Keith Haring, and the reason why I bring him up today, is because the paint didn't matter to him so much as the canvas. Keith Haring rose to fame by drawing on the walls of the New York subway system. He would go out in the middle of the night with chalk, and he would draw in the black spaces that had been set aside for pasting up advertisements, right? Some of his most famous work is street murals. So he didn't invent street art, he didn't invent graffiti, but he learned from it. In the 1970s and the 80s, street artists around the world were creating bold graphic art and cultural commentary that could be understood by anybody. You didn't have to go to art school to make it, and you didn't have to go to a museum to appreciate it. It was just there on the wall for free. Keith Haring painted the singer Grace Jones. And I don't mean he painted a portrait of Grace Jones. I mean he painted Grace Jones. Right? He did it at a disco as part of a performance art series. And in 1986, Keith Haring opened his pop shop, which sold his artwork on t-shirts and buttons and all kinds of easy-to-afford trinkets, right? And this was actually really controversial in the art world in 1986. People said, this is really crass and capitalistic, and you're commodifying art, right? And Keith Haring's defenders said, no, you're democratizing it. Either way, putting images about racism and drugs on t-shirts and stickers meant it got out into schools and suburbs, where there were kids who were 9, 10, 11, 12 years old like me, right? Kids who were too young to subscribe to a newspaper, kids who didn't have any look in on New York street art culture, kids who weren't acting in that rarefied world of museums and art galleries. We saw this art on each other, and we said, oh, something important is happening. Right? And Keith Haring explicitly wanted kids to see his art, even though he was dealing in heavy subjects. He made murals with kids. He made murals for kids at places like children's hospitals. He taught kids how to draw, right? And now you might see why this guy wants to use the Xerox machine, right? He's thinking about how to make art cheap, fast, and accessible, and how to get art out to lots of people, including people who are often left out of the art world. And he's not the first guy to come up with this, right? Like David Hockney was making art with fax machines and copiers, and Andy Warhol was doing multiples of Marilyn Monroe and Soup, and the punk rockers of the 70s and the 80s were making art with the Xerox too because they realized you could chop up an image and use it to subvert or manipulate the original image, right? And Haring is tapping into this groundswell of ideas about how to get ideas into public spaces so that people can talk about them, which, by the way, happens to be the entire point of journalism. Right? And so, thank you. My applause line. All right, so now while Xerox art has always been a pretty small niche, as a medium, today we see those ideas replicated in all of these smaller and lighter and faster technologies that have helped us make images and manipulate them and edit them and send them out into the world really fast, like cutting and pasting with Photoshop, like remixing audio, like shooting fast and dirty with a camera phone, like playing with filters on Instagram, like making GIFs and even internet memes. And so Keith Haring was a visionary, but this unnamed teacher, who, by the way, wasn't actually unnamed, it's just I was still a baby reporter and I forgot to take their name down. But this teacher, whose name is still TK, was a genius. Right? Because this is a sculpting teacher who had a student who didn't want to sculpt, right? And so this teacher had to make a decision. And a lot of teachers would say, no, thank you. This is not the class for you. Right? They might even be offended. They might see this as a rejection of their whole art. But this teacher understood that Keith Haring was not rejecting art. He still wanted to make art. He still loved art. He was still studying art. He was just asking to try a new canvas. And this teacher not only said okay, but this teacher helped him make it happen. And I bring this up to you today for two reasons. So I've stood at this podium twice before, and both times journalism was in the midst of adapting to a new platform. The first time I was here was when I graduated, which was in 1999, and we were figuring out how to use this new thing called the internet. And the next time, more than a decade later, I was back here as a teacher, and my entire job was to teach you how to report on the internet. The entire industry had changed in that time. And then once we got okay with that, then we had to learn how to do it on the cell phone, right? And both times we freaked out. Were traditional media going to die? Would anybody get jobs? Would readers and viewers stick around? Would anything look good on these little tiny screens rendered in light instead of ink? How are we going to fit anything into 140 characters? And I'm not going to tell you that these transitions were easy or that the answers were obvious. We're still figuring these things out. These changes have been good for people and bad for others. Some jobs have been created, but others have been destroyed or are less stable or are just different. But here is what I want you to remember. The canvas has changed, but we are still making art. And when you leave this courtyard today and go out into the world, I want you to remember that the canvas and the art are not the same. The canvas is going to change on you all of the time. But what you have learned here, how to listen to a story, how to tell a story, how to know what a story even is, that's art. And that lasts forever. And our art only gets richer when we move it onto new platforms. So here's the last thing that I want to tell you about Keith Haring's art teacher. Remember how I told you that I thought once that I might come back to teach here when I turned 70? I came back here when I turned 32. And that's because rapid technological change demands younger and younger editors and producers and teachers. I was hired because I could run a website, and you are going to be hired because you know how to work in whichever canvas comes next. So soon, and maybe much sooner than you think, you are going to be in charge of people who are younger than you. And they're going to be your interns or your production team or your reporting staff or your own students. And then one day, someone on your sculpting team is going to tell you that they don't want to sculpt. They want to do something really weird. And you're going to have to make a decision. And when you do, ask yourself, is this person rejecting the art of journalism? Or is this person just asking to try a new canvas? And if that's all it is, then you let Keith Haring use the Xerox machine instead. That's it. Congratulations, you guys.